समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
Hello and welcome to a fresh new episode of Geopolitics with Swasti, where our consulting editor for strategic and international affairs, Swasti Rao, takes your questions, dear subscribers, on geopolitical developments around the world. Swasti, like always, we have a host of questions, and today I will start with a question by Kushal Kamra, who wants you to shed some light on the news of Japanese engine being offered for development. He follows it up with a question where he says that additionally, we have been in close collaboration with the Russians since so many years with a huge fleet of Russian jets which have been assembled or built in India. I am not sure about it, but of course, you can shed more light. His question then is, why couldn't we build similar versions of jet engines as of yet?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I know why Kushal has asked this question, because really, of late, it has been literally doing several rounds on social media, and everybody is so excited about the Japanese offering their IHI XF9 afterburning turbofan engines to us for our AMCA. AMCA is the advanced medium combat aircraft that the fifth generation aircraft that we are trying to develop indigenously. Now, the thing is that, about the engine per se, Japan developed it for their own fighter aircraft program, and the report said that they have offered it to India. Now, the point is that it looks very good on paper, but in reality, it is a rumor. So please don't buy these rumors. Japan has not offered anything to India. And just in terms of how good the engine is really good. The engine, basically, in size, it is comparable to the GE, the General Electric F110 engine, which is also a turbofan engine. The thing about the GE F110 is that, and why am I mentioning this, is because the Turkish fifth generation fighter aircraft, the Khan project that we keep referring to now, especially after how Turkey became a point of deliberation following India's Operation Sindoor. So the prototypes for the Turkish Khan project, that fifth generation aircrafts have the GE F110, which are also turbofan engines. And if you compare the Japanese engine to them, it is actually having 30% more thrust. So it's a relatively more powerful compared to the GE, which is the General Electric, the American one. But apart from that, as far as the news goes, it is a rumor. If at all there is a situation that the Japanese were to really offer us something like that, and would it make sense? So hypothetically speaking, yes, if Japanese were to offer us something like that, it is a very good engine. I just told you that the thrust is even better than the GE F110. But if India will go ahead with it or not will depend on a lot of things. What is the level of transfer of technology? What is the total cost negotiating committee? Recommendations, etc. What are the conditions? So there will be a whole host of factors which will determine whether or not India is going to go on board, if at all the Japanese were to offer it to us. As of now, it is a rumor. And not just that, I can give you a long list of rumors which are doing the rounds, especially in the defense circles, but there is no point hurting egos unnecessarily. So, let us just wait for something more palpable to emerge. But so far, it's a rumor.
But also then, Swasti, his second question is that why has India then not been able to manufacture its own jet engines?
Well, I understand that. And the second part of his question was also about, the fact that we have Russian jets, so why are we not co-producing the engines? So very quickly, there is, indigenously speaking, we have developed our own engine, which is called Kaveri. And the Kaveri engine doesn't have the power which is required for making it deployable in a real aircraft, which is, fifth generation or 4.5 generation, or, like a fighter aircraft. Because the dry run for Kaveri is about 80 kilonewton of thrust, and for a fighter aircraft, you need something which between 100 to 120 or 130 kilonewton of thrust. Okay, so as of now, the dry Kaveri is deployable in our drones, maybe the Ghatak UCAV, but not really for the fighter aircraft. And we right now we are in talks, and I would say very advanced talks with the Safran, which is the French manufacturer, to go ahead with developing our own engine. So far, we don't have it confirmed, even though all indicators suggest that Safran is going to be the one. So unless that happens, of course, we are dependent on foreign procured engines like the GE 404 or the 414, etc., etc.
Moving ahead from there, Swasti, from Japan to West Asia, we have a question by our subscriber Satya Pragyan Das, who wants to know how will the PKK's disarmament play out in West Asia?
Now, interesting. PKK stands for the Kurdistan's Workers' Party, and as you know, that they have been fighting a kind of an armed resistance against Turkey, basically. And then, if you look at the map, you will see how Turkey, Syria, Iraq, etc. plays. So naturally, what happens is that most of these parties are, most of these groups are actually then located in northern Syria, in Iraq, etc., and all these places. Now, what happened recently was that about 30 fighters from the PKK, in a very ceremonial manner, kind of gave up their arms. And this is how it started to gain ground, because obviously this is something which might change the balance of power in West Asia, and especially at a time when Syria is so unstable, etc. But you have to just, understand things a little bit better, which is that why it matters is because since 1990s, okay, this group has been launching their attacks. Okay, and more than 40,000 people have died. So naturally, when there is a question on their disarmament, it would obviously gain a lot of attention. Now, the thing is that, in my opinion, it is very symbolic. And why do I say it is symbolic? I will tell you why so. Because the thing is that if you look at the map, you will understand that it is not just about some groups which are operating in one particular region. Where this particular disarmament happened was in northern Iraq. But then there are also groups in Syria, which are also, PKK groups, and so on and so forth. So it is just coming from one small faction. And if you ask me what is the purpose of it, the purpose is that Erdogan wants to show some kind of a progress on this matter, because so that he can pull off the elections. Right.
Absolutely.
So this is where it's actually coming from. Okay, that's the first thing. The question that everybody needs to now look at is, how is this going to unfold? Not just in northern Iraq where it's happened, but also in Syria, which is a very, very unstable region right now, and also in Iran. Right? So basically, if you want to have a fuller understanding of where the PKK movement is going, you will have to take into account all these regions, and not just this little ceremonial 30 fighters giving up on their arms to please Erdogan in some way. And then you have to also understand another layer of why the PKK resolution of this problem is easier said than done. And I'll tell you some reasons for it. Like, for example, I just mentioned that so far what has happened is northern Iraq, right? In Syria, please understand that this is the largest and the most effective militia. So, given the current anarchy in Syria, you please understand that they also have very strong historical ties with the United States, because United States never wants its boots on the ground, and United States kind of enjoys the influence that it wields through these kind of groups. And the PKK, the Kurdistan, groups within Syria are then very important. So will it then also extend to Syria is one question. Not just that, in Iraq, please remember that it is the PKK that hosts the Iranian opposition forces, and they also enjoy Israeli support. So, in fact, there's something that you should know which makes it so interesting. And please pay attention to what I'm saying. Prior to the fall of Syria, prior to the fall of Assad in Syria, every single Israeli operation in Iran started from Iraqi Kurdistan. So, what you there see is that Tel Aviv, which is Israel, is kind of mirroring the Iranian proxy strategy by way of PKK. So there are so many more layers to this.
So
And
interesting.
and you'd be surprised where I got all this understanding from. I was recently in Greece, I told you, where I
Yes.
met a whole host of experts from the Middle Eastern region, and we kind of landed up discussing this. And in the discussions, I kind of realized that how deep the issue is. It is not just about the 30 fighters giving up their arms. It is much, much, much deeper. Will Israel and the US give up on their sort of proxy strategy? We are always usually talking about Iran's proxies.
Right.
But actually, you understand that the PKK also doubles up as, Israel's proxies.
Proxy.
So this is something which is much deeper than what meets the eye. So finally, I don't think that this is going to be very deep. And if you genuinely think that this is the end of the Kurdish aspirations for their own state, I think you are just deluding yourself, right? So we will see how it unfolds. Right now, it is just for some political gains by Erdogan.
Swasti, since we are discussing US, I will take the next question by our subscriber Aditya18893, who asks you that what, according to you, are the benefits and possible threats which India can face while entering into a trade deal with the US?
Okay. And I think there's also another part which is added, which is that in
Yes.
case India were to also face sanctions on buying Russian oil, etc., which is like the
Yes,
second
which
part of
is-
this question.
huh.
And that's why I think I suggested that let's take this question because it is interesting. Now, much has been said about the India-US trade deal. I have done multiple worldviews and discussions on it. Okay, so I'll just be very brief and tell you what are the risks and what are the gains. So
Right.
let's just start with the situation right now. The situation right now is that the 10% baseline tariffs will remain. The negotiation is around helping India to drop the additional tariffs that Donald Trump put on the 2nd of April, which is
Right.
usually referred to as Celebration Day.
Hmm.
And that additional tariff is about 26%. So the best case scenario for us right now is that whatever we are looking at in terms of the mini trade deal, we want only the 10% baseline tariffs to remain and we want the 26% tariffs to drop.
Right.
And that is where this Ukraine situation becomes important because according to Lindsey Graham and Blumenthal bill, what they have been saying is that countries that continue buying oil from Russia, basically, Devdata, what makes this situation interesting is that so far there is just so much criticism and kerfuffle around what happens now that the European Union has sanctioned an Indian company. This is a much easier situation for us to control because according to the new regulations, what they have done is that they have reduced the price cap. So earlier the price cap was a $60 per barrel, and now the price cap has been reduced to $47.6 per barrel, which means that if we comply by that, we may take a call to not comply by that. That's a different thing. But if we comply, basically we are just getting it cheaper.
Right.
Okay, so there is no problem with respect to buying the oil as long as we are buying it within the, under the price cap. And it's a completely different argument on whether we should be adhering to it or not adhering to it, whether we should have strategic autonomy or not. That's a different thing. I will take it up separately. But what I'm trying to say is that this is a lesser evil. What the United States is doing, and especially if you've been looking and if you've been hearing these statements made by several, high-ups in the Trump administration, they have been coming up in very, very, brutal terms saying that if countries go on buying Russian oil because they want to end the war, and they say that by buying the Russian oil and giving Russia that
You're
money, you're
sustaining
prolonging
it.
that war, okay? They are going to be levying 100% to 500% tariffs. Okay, as secondary tariffs on countries. Now, imagine that here is a situation where all we are having to do is to sort of comply by the regulations and buy it within the price cap. And here there is a situation where if we continue buying, we are going to be facing 100% to 500% tariffs. And whereas the ground situation today is that we are only worried about removing the 26% of tariffs. So that is what makes it so difficult that you're caught between the devil and the deep blue sea.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is just one part that I wanted to sort of, clarify for you as to where exactly does the deal stand right now and what is going to be in India's interest. And I have already argued in my pieces that instead of strategic autonomy, India should be looking at resilience because the situation is complicated. Now, very quickly about what is the risks and gains, okay, of the US-India deal. Now, as far as the gains are concerned, India could gain in sectors like textile, jewelry, footwear. Okay, this is one part. And what happens here is that we could have an export upside of $4 to $6 billion annually over the next 3 years if the duty relief is phased in. So certainly we stand to gain from there. We also stand to gain from pharmaceuticals. Why? Because any harmonization or mutual recognition of what is known as the goods manufacturing practice or the GMP, those inspections and FDA timelines, so any harmonization of GMP and FDA would reduce the non-trade barriers by 15 to 20%, and this could accelerate India's generics access, okay, and bring down the approval lead timeline from 10 to 12 months to about 6 to 8 months. Now, why did I tell you all this gyan? I gave you all this gyan because what has happened is that if you look at data, the Indian pharma exports to the US stood at about $7.2 billion in the financial year 2024,
Right.
which was much lower than the $8.6 billion that we exported to the US in financial year 2022. And this difference came from regulatory bottlenecks. So basically, the idea is that we could gain from in pharmaceuticals in that segment if we are able to harmonize and mutually recognize the GMP and the FDA timeline. And those can reduce the access, right now, which is standing at 12 to 18 months to 6 to 8 months. And I told you why this matters, because this is something where we have which is our stronghold. And if we are able to do this, we can basically come down and then therefore export more. So those are the reasons why textile, jewelry, footwear and pharmaceuticals are important. Now, as far as risks are concerned, there are basically two major risks: dairy and agriculture. And dairy and agriculture we are very, very clear that we are not going to risk the lives of millions and millions of Indian dairy farmers and otherwise, general farmers due to this. And I'll give you some data to understand why this matters so much. I'll give you an example. The US milk yield per cow stands at 7,400 liters per year. The Indian average is 2,400 liters. Now, what you can totally see that there is a threefold productivity edge that the United States has. So, even if they were to get a 5% market share, like gain a 5% market share, the US imports could displace 3 to 4 million Indian dairy farmers. That is how much we are at risk. Similarly, in agriculture, again, we have the similar concerns. If we were to remove import tariffs, right, then US grains, which are highly subsidized in their own, economy, they could flood our markets. Okay. And we can totally see that they have already done it with Africa. So usually if you go to the discussions, you will see that we are actually seeing that this kind of a situation or this kind of a strategy has not really worked for developing economies.
Yeah, because then
So-
it spells doom for India.
So basically what we want to basically avoid dumping. And if we remove these protections, we are again risking the lives of more than 700 million farmers.
Right.
But remember, India is still largely an agricultural society.
Absolutely.
So this is why these are the risks. This is what US is pushing us for. But as in terms of gains, I already told you. So far in this particular deal, there is no question of services, which is again a stronghold. So I mean, frankly, don't expect anything too ambitious from it. This is more of a ploy to keep Donald Trump appeased, and at the same time, try and get some gains for jewelry, footwear, and all that, pharmaceuticals, etc. So this is where it stands. And I also told you about the risks that might come into place if the Lindsey Graham bill were to get passed and adopted, because that is serious stuff. All this while we were thinking that Donald Trump will not do it. But if you look at the rhetoric in the last 1 week alone, now the US is asking the Europeans to comply.
Right.
Okay, so this is getting a little serious. We will see how it goes. And like I said, that India's response would not be, strategic autonomy so much right now, because trade is quite dependent on so many factors. It would be about resilience. So we will see how it plays out. But it is true that we are on very, very precarious grounds, right?
With that word of caution, Swasti, I will move on to a question on China. We actually have a lot of questions on China. I'll club two of them together so that we have a comprehensive one. The first one is by Ravi Rules, who has a simple question that what are we doing at the SCO and what is India's current and future role at the SCO? And similarly, Sunil asks that with the SCO and with all these discussions, has China now fully decided to use Pakistan as a proxy in its conflicts with India?
Yeah.
And are we then at a stage where China and Pakistan have an understanding of when and what to do with India?
So I understand. I mean, this question and the way you've sort of elaborated upon it, I think this kind of reflects a lot of Indians' way of thinking right
Point of
now,
view,
and
yeah.
especially after our own armed forces said that China basically fought us with a borrowed knife, okay, which is Pakistan. So just understand a few things. I think when you say India, China, Pakistan, this particular equation, you have to understand a few things. With our equation with Pakistan is actually very clear,
Yeah.
which is that yes, they would like to constantly wage a war with us, okay, but when it comes to China, it is something else, because China is also about economic dependence and all that, and that is the complexity that he's trying to basically understand. Now, first of all, and it's interesting because a lot of times when I'm actually teaching about it, I always say that our problems with China can be understood as SMDI. They are structural. S stands for structural, MD stands for
Military.
multidimensional, and I stands for intersectional. Okay? Our problems with China are structural, multidimensional, and intersectional. And that is what makes it so complex. When I say structural, of course, at the heart of everything is the disputed and undemarcated LAC. It runs into more than 3,000 kilometers, and you know how many wars we fought over it and how many escalations and military
Right.
standoffs we have had. That's one part. The second structural problem with respect to China is the difference in our strategic visions. Our worldviews, the strategic worldviews, are mutually irreconcilable. They cannot be reconciled. We think of a multipolar Asia, multipolar world. China thinks of a unipolar Asia led by China, unipolar Indo-Pacific led by China. And even though they say multipolar world, basically they only mean a bipolar world where they and US are the only peer competitors. Okay,
Right.
so there, and it is in the official documents of the CCP to contain the regional rise of India. So the worldview per se is something which is very asymmetrical,
Yeah.
which cannot be aligned. So these are the structural problems. When I say multidimensionals, of course, economic overdependence that we have with the Chinese and the challenges it brings, the military situation that we have with the Chinese, the asymmetry that we have in terms of military capabilities, the neighborhood destabilization that China keeps doing for us. With Pakistan, it is very, very obvious. But what it is doing with Nepal, with Bhutan, with Bangladesh is also more visible now.
Yes.
But with Maldives, with Sri Lanka, and how it is now getting aided by Turkey in all of this is something which is not so obvious, but something which is very, very important. Not just that, the mind games that CCP keeps playing, in terms of propping up all these anti-India factions in these countries, the cyber attacks that it does on us, the disinformation that comes with it, the hybrid attacks capabilities that it shows, it kind of unveils in the Indo-Pacific region. All of these are the multidimensional aspects. And please remember that the intersectional aspects come when you look at how the Krink axis is unfolding in different theaters all at once. And of course, the Krink axis is China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. So South Asia, it's China, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, etc. In a different theater, it is China, North Korea, Russia. In yet another theater, it is China, Iran, Russia, etc. So what I'm saying is that not all these actors are hostile to us, but
Right.
all these actors are way too dependent on China than
China.
they are on us. And this intersectionality that you see also gives us the complexity that I just said. So remember, structural, multidimensional, and intersectional. So our problems with China are thus. Therefore, all this that you see with respect to tactical visits or rapprochements or diplomatic outreaches, everything is about aiding or small parts in our larger counterbalancing to China.
Right.
We don't come with such deep pockets. We are not able to convert, our economic statecraft into diplomatic leverage as China has. We honestly don't have that worldview. We don't intend to become expeditionary, navy. We don't have any extra territorial ambitions. We don't believe in sort of imagining our own borders with our neighbors. So we don't do anything of that. It is very, very complex, and what we are doing by way of all the tactical rapprochement that you keep seeing is that we are buying ourselves the time so that we are able to coexist with a country with whom we have massive economic interdependence. In fact, not just interdependence, it is one-way dependence. It is wrong to say we have interdependence. It is one-way dependence, where out of the $125 billion worth of trade, more than $100 billion is in our trade deficit. And more we export to the West, more we actually import from China. Why? Because we need the time to really add more value to our manufacturing base. Remember, we are not being able to become the beneficiaries of China Plus One diversification, etc. So it's a long story. If I get into the details, it will again become very long. But the idea about China is that it is true that when you will, with this one thing that I told you about, with this one analytical framework that I told you about structural, multidimensional, and intersectional, you will be able to put all these elements together. So whether you see China propping up Bangladesh, whether you see a China Pakistan Bangladesh trilateral formally taking shape, whether you see a China Pakistan Afghanistan trilateral formally taking shape, whether you see what China is doing by way of BRICS, what China is doing by way of SCO, all of this will become clearer to you. And once again, now coming back to your question on SCO, see, India doesn't gain much from being in the SCO. We could not even get a joint statement. We could not even get them to mention Pahalgam while they didn't mention Balochistan. So you can totally see that it is China's hand which is invisibly playing the balance of power to sort of tilt to one side and not on other side. And we could see that Russia couldn't do anything either, that we consider our old friend. And that also shows what kind of a dependence do all these friends of ours actually have on China. So very quickly, India doesn't gain much from being inside the SCO. The RATS, the regional anti-terrorist structure, is not able to help India's terrorism in any way. It is effective for Russia, it is effective for China for their own ISIS Khorasan and the East Turkestan movement, etc., but not for us. And the second thing is that China and the Central Asian countries have already started to now engage unilaterally, keeping Russia on the side. So Russia's decline also in the region makes it important for us to at least be present, because if we are not there, whenever there has been a power vacuum, it is China that has usurped the power vacuum. Whether it's been the power vacuum left by the United States in Afghanistan, whether it is a power vacuum which is happening now because of Russia's decline in the Caucasus, in the Middle Eastern region, in its own backyard, all of that is going to China's advantage and Turkey's advantage. Okay. Right. And that is why, even though Turkey is not directly, related with the SCO and with BRICS and all that, but what I mean to underline and underscore here is that India needs to be in these platforms in order to make sure that the balance of power doesn't completely tilt into China's favor. And all these countries that are in differing degrees, parts of the global south, the loosely termed global south, do not completely fall into the lap of China. So the argument is that even if we do not gain much from being in the SCO, at least we are not losing much by not being there at all. If it is useful, in my opinion, it is not useful. But India also likes to play its own old game of multi-alignment, and India uses Quad to balance BRICS, uses BRICS to balance Quads, uses SCO to make sure it has outreach to Central Asia, but we are not a big player there. Ultimately we can only become a big player right now by triangular cooperation, so by joining hands with an advanced country, and two, in the longer run, which is actually a much more I would say foolproof method, is when we really become embedded in the global manufacturing and chains, right? Otherwise, everything else is just simply decorative. So the GDP numbers that we keep throwing is actually the GDP because of our sheer size. It is not because of GDP per capita, or it is not manufacturing that is growing in proportion to the GDP. It is only coming down. So keeping all this in mind kind of explains that India gains a lot out of this political multi-alignment. Right. But just the political multi-alignment is not enough. And actually, SCO meeting was one of the first diplomatic tests of just how much China controls, the strategic semantics of all these countries. And we really saw that India was not able to do it. And very rightfully, Rajnath ji refused to sign on it. So right now, when Dr. Jaishankar goes to China, it is also to keep in mind the fact that there are so many elements that make this dialogue necessary right now. Right. And therefore, it should be applauded, but always with strategic caution, because the structural problems cannot have tactical solutions.
So firstly, all that we discussed, we still need to understand why Pakistan becomes a key player in all of this.
Yeah, see, Pakistan becomes a key player because of several reasons, okay? Of course, the economic reason is very clear. China's BRI ambitions through the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is focused on the port of Gwadar, etc. It is touted at about $60 billion. right? $60 billion is not a joke. Huh?
Yeah.
So it is valued around $60 billion. It is something which is one of the flagship sort of projects under the BRI from China in this region. And for that, China will always ensure that it has strategic depth in Pakistan and in Afghanistan to protect its economic interests. So that's one part, why Pakistan becomes so important. And by the way, that also explains why the China, Pakistan, Afghanistan trilateral has already met formally, because as we try to have our own strategic depth in Afghanistan by engaging the Taliban, trying to sort of reduce Afghanistan's dependence on the Karachi port by offering to, offering Chabahar, okay, in Iran, where we have invested. On the contrary, China is trying to increase their own strategic depth in Pakistan by offering to connect it to Gwadar, So we are at loggerheads there, and all that. So the economic angle, of course, is one, and I'm not even getting into the encircling that they do with respect to our neighborhoods, because the question is just on Pakistan. The other explanation is military. China-Pakistan military coordination, cooperation is very, very intense, right? And I remember, please notice that I mentioned the word not just cooperation, but also coordination, okay? I'll give you some examples. So the JF-17 fighter jets that Pakistan has co-produced with China is something that we also need to understand better. Not only did they start co-producing it very early on, as Pakistan got cut off from the F-16 program, from the US. So they started on very early. They are built in Pakistan, okay? And they are also sold to other countries. So China and Pakistan are not just building fighter jets, but they are also selling it to third countries. And the latest and the most consequential sale has been made to Azerbaijan. And that is not all, because these jets that Pakistan and China are co-producing, okay, selling to other countries, have Turkish missiles on them.
Right.
And that is why I keep talking about the Turkish, Pakistani, and the Chinese systems integration. Not just about buying and selling of some weapons. That's not the point. It is not so simple. Okay, not just that. In 2015, Pakistan got about the Yuan class submarines from China. And what is to be underscored here is that 4 of them were actually sourced from China, and 4 of them were made at the Karachi shipyard. So again, you understand, it is not just about simple sale of or buying or purchase of military equipment. It is about co-designing, co-producing, and then also co-selling. Similarly, Pakistan has the SH-15 155 mm self-propelled artillery guns, and they have deployed it at the Indian border. And this is also from China. Just now, the Royal International Air Tattoo 2025 was concluded in the UK, where the Pakistani Air Force flaunted its JF-17 jets, in all glory. So these are things we need to be careful about, that the China-Pakistan bonhomie is not just about sales. I think the armed forces have nailed it very, very correctly, saying that China fought us with a borrowed knife, and it just kind of fits into the Chinese larger strategic game of never having a direct confrontation with India when there is Pakistan to do the dirty work. And now a destabilization from the other side in Bangladesh. But since the question was in Pakistan, I thought I'll just sort of, explain it a little better to you.
Going ahead, Swasti, we have a question by a non-subscriber, Lethal Knight, but I think it's an interesting question, hence I decided to keep it. And he asks on the implications of the latest bombing of Syria by Israel and the possibility of Greater Israel.
Interesting question again, man. With everything regarding the Middle East, this is also fairly layered and complex. But at the heart of this question is the Druze minority, which resides in many parts. It's like in regions of Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan. And they are, a Shia community, although they have kind of evolved from that traditional Shia sort of identity. What has happened is that after Assad's fall and the kind of government that we now see in Israel, which is in many ways propped up by Turkey and all that, and, it's very close to the West, they are pushing for a more centralized state in Syria. Whereas, like I just mentioned, the Druze and the Kurds, etc., all of them, they want a more federalized kind of a state. Now, as a result of this clash, the Syrian army recently started to kind of deploy many forces along it in order to control the Druze community. Now, in Syria, there are about 700,000 of them. Now, when they started getting attacked by the Syrian military, Israel came in defense of them, and Israel started to bomb
Syria.
Syria left, right, and center. In fact, the pictures were very, very
Yes.
all over internet. But that is why Israel came and Israel did it. Now, why did Israel do it? Absolutely for two reasons. One is to secure its own borders, because if you look at the map, you will see that too much of military deployment, the Syrian military deployment in that region, is a direct threat to Israel. And Israel, under its own new Middle Eastern order that has been created after Iran has been weakened and Syria, Assad has fallen in Syria, etc., is not going to tolerate too much of military deployment in that region. So one is to secure its own border. Okay, that's one which is very clear. If you actually go back and trace the statements made by Netanyahu, etc., you will see that we will not allow. They talk in that condescending tone. So that's one. The second is that by supporting the Druze and by strengthening and empowering the Druze community, like I said, if you remember in the previous question to PKK, I said that Israel treats them as a proxy.
Yes.
Israelis also treat these as a proxy to keep the Syrian state federalized. Okay, so you keep the autonomous demand in these small groups alive by empowering them, so that a centralized kind of an Syrian state doesn't come into being, because a centralized Syrian state would again be a problem for Israel. And then Israel wants to balance the rise of Turkey there. So there are many, many angles there that I don't have the time to get into. But to your simple question, and please remember, Israel wants to keep using these outfits as its proxies, because I kind of realized when I was researching for on all this, and I was reading up on all this, while we always talk about Iran's proxies, we never talk about Israel's proxies. And maybe that is an idea for a column.
And with that, Swasti, we come to an end of this episode. We look forward to your questions for an episode next week. Until then, stay tuned.
And please consider becoming subscribers to the print,
Yes.
because that is when you are sure that we would not miss your question.